All right. Greetings, everyone. It is good to be back. It is good to be able to do another video. And first and foremost, I want to thank you for all of your comments on my previous videos. All of you sharing your experiences and making those awesome comments. I appreciate it a ton. So that's what makes it all worthwhile. Now, since it's been a little while, so I hope everybody's doing well, but as you can see, my hair has grown a little bit since last time, which is an awesome thing. But this video in particular, this has been on my mind, it's been on my heart, I should say, for the past, good Lord, how long? It's probably been maybe 6 months or so, but finally, today, I am getting around to doing it. So I am so glad to be doing so. So this topic is near and dear to my heart. It is, why is the goth scene essentially gradually declining, or should I say just an all-out decline in the United States, in particular in the United States. Now I'm sure there's other places around the world, but for this I'm going to cover just the United States. And at the same time I keep an optimist, so my question at the end is there hope? Is there a chance for revival in this scene? Now, to get into this topic, I'm going to first start off with kind of the obvious stuff. So why is the goth scene declining in the United States? Now, the obvious stuff is going to trace back in history a little bit, over even the past few decades. Now, there was a decline, let's put it this way, when I got into the scene, the decline had already started. Now, essentially going back into your goth history, right? You know, your goth rock started out with, in the late 1970s, your post-punk, you know, of course, Bauhaus gets the credit for, in 1979, with kind of starting it all, although Susie and the Banshees were around, they were more associated with the punk scene at the time, and also kind of your punk, post-punk scene, so Joy Division, etc., and kind of that experimentation in sound. But Bauhaus gets the, you know, the first label with that, and there's other bands like The Damned and even The Cure were around at the time. Now anyway, you know, it kind of explodes into the early 80s. You have bands like Specimen, Alien Sex Fiend, and everybody. The Sisters of Mercy come out of it. And by the mid-80s, you know, there's a solid subculture that has already, you know, started up. Essentially, fashion-wise, it's borrowing, at least quotes from the early bands. They were essentially mimicking the Hammer Horror band, or Hammer Horror films. So they were kind of mimicking that style fashion-wise, and so with that, you know, it has the look, etc. And so really you're seeing the solidification of the look and everything in the 80s, and, you know, the subculture's expanding, you know, it's you know, mainstream media is paying attention to it, doing interviews, all kinds of other stuff. Anyway, you have your second wave bands in the late 80s into the early 90s, but there's something that kind of deviates. The industrial scene, you know, has already kind of also kind of like a sibling to it, and that's popularity's growing. And then by the time you have like Nine Inch Nails in the early 90s, there's kind of this shift where at least goth clubs, right, are starting to play more industrial music. And honestly, when I first got into the scene, like, that was the case. Obviously into the 90s, you know, your goth bands kind of lessened in popularity. Now, you still had like material being made by The Cure and other artists, but as far as the second wave bands, I mean, they, you know, were nowhere near the fame or the, you know, and whatnot as the first wave bands. So bands, those are a lot of the bands that I personally like, you know, bands like, you know, Nosferatu, Incubus Succubus, The Awakening, Two Witches, and so on and so forth, The Wake, etc. But so these are the bands that I really got into when I got into the you know, got into, well, I shouldn't say I got into the scene, but the bands that I enjoy to this very day. But some of which were bands that I got into early on in the scene. Sure, I heard The Cure. You know, that's probably the first band I ever heard, probably from the radio, but bands like Fear Cult, Nosferatu, those are the bands that were some of the early bands that I got into. But anyway, point of the matter being, industrial kind of takes over, right? Industrial is, you know, in the clubs, you know, unless it's a strictly goth event when it comes to traditional goth rock, most of your you know, your quote-unquote goth clubs are playing a hybrid mixture of industrial, synth pop, EBM, you know, agrotech, and maybe some goth rock here and there, dark wave, etc. So there's a hybrid of styles all in one setting, at least in the United States especially. In my experiences at places overseas, sure, they were doing similar things where they're playing different styles, but some of the bigger clubs were able to cater to specific genres or have a specific night for it. And that's awesome. To me, that was cool because it showed how big the scene was. But anyway, at least here, you know, that's how it was. Now, the big thing for the United States, what happened? 1999, Columbine, and the aftermath after that. With Columbine, even though they're not associated technically with the goth scene or whatever, it still got lumped in. You know, you wore all black, you're evil, blah, 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 blah. Right? So, with that, you're going to see the popularity in mainstream media or whatnot, kind of the, just in general, it just kind of wanes. And the other thing is, when I got into goth, you know, I was the cliche mall goth, or baby bat, but definitely mall goth. What bands did I listen to? Like, before I got into the actual traditional goth rock bands, and even industrial bands? Well, they were new metal bands. Korn, right? Cold Chamber, Static X. And even though these bands borrowed from those styles of like industrial and just the looks and images and imagery, etc., they weren't technically, you know, goth bands, right? Traditional goth bands. But that was kind of the style. So anyway, with that in mind, getting into the club scene in the early 2000s, you know, when I talk to people, sure, you know, people my age, etc., like we all kind of shared that and that interest in music. Additionally, you know, music identity was a big deal. What you listened to was a huge part of your identity. In particular, the early 2000s for me. And now, mind you, from my previous videos, I've also said that I'm a huge metal fan also. So there's kind of a dual, you know, history musically for me that's taking place. You know, I was into, you know, new metal also, but I also, you know, got into like the new wave of American heavy metal. I got into black metal, death metal, and all that good stuff around that same time. So anyway, what has occurred since? Well, a few things have occurred since. When I left my city's area, right, the city of Philadelphia, some of our big events stopped. Even towards the end, into the late 2000, well, I shouldn't say late, the early 2010s, excuse me, the early 2010s, you saw it where there were kind of like some number losses when it came to the attendees of events. Gradual. But you did see a lot, because electronic music was you know, kind of growing. Like EDM was growing, and like Skrillex and all that stuff, dubstep and all that stuff. So there was kind of this like, hey, come to our events, kind of like crossover type of stuff. And so that was already starting around that time. I remember I was in my industrial, agrotech band at the time. So, you know, things were, you know, there were like kind of DIY events, and there was stuff out there. People were going to events. It wasn't all just one club. There were different things going on. There was more variety, but still there was kind of this gradual decline. And things were a little tough economically at that time, so not everybody was going to events. There were still some solid tours. I remember Skinny Puppy played a big tour at that time, but, you know, things were a little tough here and there. Now, I left for the military, but one of the biggest things is when I returned, and this is 2017, fast forward to then, when I returned, pretty much all of the old staples were gone as far as club events. They were just kind of gone. A couple of promoters were still doing things, but they were much smaller in scale. And I remember when I went to an event, I'm like, hey, everybody, I was super happy. But it was interesting. Like a lot of one of the things, the impressions I got when I got it, I was like, wow, like people don't seem very happy. What's going on? So what I discovered was that because here I am, isolated in the military in a small beach town where, nobody really cared about politics and nobody really cared. It was just go to the beach and have a good day. Here there's this divide and, all because of political ideologies and just kind of, complaining and arguing and debating and basically, folks are, cutting their ties with one another. Friendships are ending, which was, tragic, but this is occurring. So all this drama had taken place while I was gone, with different friend groups and whatnot, and so it just was really detrimental. And I'm sure this was not just isolated to, my city. This was probably across the board, across the entire country when it came to their local goth and industrial scenes. So fast forward 2020. Now, and I'm not even just talking about social, political, and cultural, differences. What I'm talking about here is going to be economic issues. Now, first and foremost, 2020, lockdowns, nobody's able to leave, right? So DJs and bands started to adapt. They would do, online, videos, they perform online, they do DJ sets online and whatnot. People got comfortable not going to places. So once clubs started up, by 2021, 2022, even last year, events are taking place, but the numbers aren't even close because whatever people's views, some people are just, maybe they have, they have pre-existing conditions, and to them it's not worth it to be in crowds. So I'm sure there are goths that maybe they have that type of medical situation where they still are not, they do not want to go to an event because of that. And that's their choice. Others, went to events right off of the bat. It all depends. And I'm sure there's, in different states that had less restrictions, COVID restrictions, I'm sure they had events going on even then and whatnot. And, either way. So this is taking place. Now, since then, the economy has made things pretty rough. So with that in mind, and with myself having, for funsies, right, had some events and stuff that I participated in and whatnot, hosted. So with that in mind, things have been pretty tough, right, on top of, with the economy. You have to have it where you have these events, you have these bands, while also hoping to get an audience there to participate. And so there's a difficulty in that. And I'm sure, events all across the country have had these difficulties. Some have had to adjust, right? Having, instead of a monthly event, geez Louise, in the early 2000s, it was a weekly goth event. Weekly. In fact, there were probably multiple weekly, if I'm not mistaken. And here's the craziest thing. Our biggest goth event in the city of Philadelphia was on a Wednesday night. It was on a Wednesday night. It wasn't even a weekend, but people still came out. You're talking well over 100, 200, however many people. I don't remember the capacity of the venue. But either way, it seemed like there were multiple hundreds of people. That is wild by today's standards. Let's put it this way. Unless you are a legacy act, the Sisters of Mercy, The Cure, right, Susie and the Banshees, or Susie Sue on her own, whoever else, unless you are a legacy act, you just will not see the numbers. So anyway, without blabbering on too much, with this decline, even though there's kind of a growing, I don't know if you want to call it a third wave of goth rock bands or fourth wave of goth rock bands or whatnot, but there are young artists out there that are making great music. But the thing is, because of how things are right now, they're not able to tour, they're not able to book shows. Let's put it this way, venues, promoters, and I totally understand, they can't risk it. They can't risk booking a band when they know they're not going to have a good turnout or whatnot, or they just can't risk a low turnout in order to pay their production fees or whatnot. And so there are definitely some rough times. While there are some scenes out there that are doing pretty well in other nations, as far as the United States is concerned, it's been continually getting rough and rough. Now, in addition to that, this year in particular saw a huge kind of boom in, legacy acts. Sure, there was the Cruel World Festival that had like Bauhaus last year, but that kind of trend has continued. The Cure just did a huge tour in like stadiums, and some of these have sold out. Now, mind you, and this is pretty obvious. This is probably clear and obvious. Not everybody that goes to see The Cure is quote unquote goth, right? I'm sure